final buzzer sounded on what had been a competitive, physically demanding game between the Golden State Valkyries and the Indiana Fever. On paper, the contest was over, but the aftermath of that game produced a sequence of events that extended well beyond the court and into a public controversy that raised serious questions about player conduct, institutional accountability, and the league's willingness to enforce professional standards. Basketball has always accommodated a certain level of competitive tension. Trash talk, hard screens, and aggressive verbal exchanges are not new to the sport. They are in many respects part of the culture. The line between competitive intensity and conduct that undermines the safety and professional environment of the league has always required active management from the organizations involved. What unfolded in the hours and days following this particular game illustrated, in specific and documented terms, what happens when that management fails to materialize. Within hours of the final buzzer, activity on Meta's text-based platform threads reflected the intensity that had defined the in-game matchup. The verbal exchanges between veteran guard Tiffany Hayes and Indiana Fever guard Caitlin Clark had generated significant attention among fans and commentators. That attention in itself was not unusual. High-profile matchups between identifiable players routinely produce elevated engagement across social platforms. What was unusual was the direction that engagement took, and more specifically, how a player with a substantial public following chose to engage with it. Posts began circulating that went beyond typical expressions of fan loyalty or competitive sentiment. Certain users began framing the rivalry in terms that moved away from athletic competition entirely, referencing the possibility of physical confrontation and expressing enthusiasm for the idea of a player losing composure on the court. Under ordinary circumstances, this type of content is either ignored by the athletes involved or managed through official channels. Hayes did neither. She entered the comments directly, responding to users who had expressed these sentiments, and in doing so, gave those expressions a degree of validation that immediately changed the nature of the conversation. Her initial reply, acknowledging the comments with a casual, self-assured response about her own composure, was the first indicator that the situation was not being handled with the seriousness it warranted. From a public communication standpoint, an athlete responding approvingly to fan posts that frame physical conduct as desirable is not a neutral act, it is a signal. To the broader audience watching that exchange, and particularly to those already operating at the edges of acceptable fan behavior, it communicated that this kind of sentiment was welcome and reciprocated. The situation moved into significantly more serious territory when a separate user escalated the language in a way that could not reasonably be interpreted as hyperbole or general enthusiasm. That user posted a claim indicating that family members were prepared to engage in coordinated physical action at the user's request, specifically targeting any response from the league regarding Hayes' on-court behavior. Hayes responded to that post with 2 words confirming the statement as legitimate. That response is worth examining carefully, because its implications extend beyond the immediate context of a social media exchange. When an active professional athlete with a verified public account and a large following directly affirms a post that references the mobilization of people for physical intimidation, the exchange is no longer a matter of fan interaction. It becomes a documented public statement that endorses a specific type of threat directed at another named professional. The target in this case was Caitlin Clark, a player who, by the time this exchange occurred, had already been the subject of documented, real-world security threats serious enough to involve law enforcement and result in an arrest. That prior history is not a minor footnote. It is central context. A player who has received credible, legally documented threats does not exist in the same risk environment as one who has not. When those documented threats are followed by a public exchange in which a fellow professional athlete endorses user commentary about physical retaliation, the threshold for institutional response should be considerably lower than it would be in a situation without that history. The league's apparent decision to allow this exchange to pass without a formal visible response was not a neutral position. It was, in practical terms, a decision to treat the matter as acceptable. The standards being applied here deserve direct scrutiny. Professional sports leagues at the major level maintain explicit codes of conduct that govern player behavior not only during games but in public communications. Those codes exist for reasons that go beyond optics. They exist because the conduct of professional athletes, particularly in public forums, directly affects the safety, reputation, and commercial viability of the league and its participants. Violations of those codes have historically been met with consequences ranging from fines to suspensions to more permanent disciplinary action, depending on the severity and nature of the conduct. The question that follows logically from this situation is whether the behavior documented in this exchange would have passed without institutional response in a different context. In other major professional leagues, conduct of this nature, specifically the public endorsement by a verified athlete of user posts referencing coordinated physical threat against a specific named player, has resulted in suspension. Not fines, suspension. The distinction matters because a fine is a financial transaction. A suspension is a structural consequence that reflects the league's position on what is and is not acceptable conduct for a player representing the organization. The absence of a suspension in this case, or any visible disciplinary measure, communicates a specific institutional position regardless of whether that position was ever formally articulated. There is a pattern worth acknowledging here that extends beyond this single incident. The WNBA has faced recurring criticism from fans, analysts, and former players regarding its consistency in applying conduct standards across its roster. Supporters of the league have pointed to its growth in viewership, ticket sales, and commercial partnerships as evidence of institutional health. Those metrics are real, and the league's recent expansion in its commercial profile has been documented across multiple credible outlets. But the commercial growth of a league and the strength of its conduct enforcement are not the same metric, and recent years have produced enough incidents to suggest a gap between the two. The comments that emerged from the audience following coverage of this particular incident reflect a level of frustration that has accumulated over time. Fans who have watched multiple cycles of conduct issues with limited visible accountability from the league have become increasingly vocal in demanding a different standard. Those demands are not coming from casual observers. They are coming from people who are invested in the sport and who recognize, with specificity, what is at stake when a professional league fails to treat conduct issues as the serious institutional matters they are. Part of what makes the response to this incident particularly striking is the contrast with how comparable incidents in other professional sports have been handled. Consider the standards applied in the NBA, which serves as the closest organizational parallel. Over the past decade, the NBA has imposed significant penalties on players for social media conduct that was determined to reflect poorly on the league or to create hostile conditions for other players. In several documented cases, those penalties were applied even when the posts in question were ambiguous or could be interpreted charitably. The standard was not whether harm had been definitively established. The standard was whether the conduct created conditions that were incompatible with the league's professional obligations to its players and its public. The WNBA operates within a media environment that magnifies these issues in ways that demand careful attention. Caitlin Clark's entry into the league generated a level of public attention that was, by any measurement, unprecedented for a WNBA player in recent years. That attention brought new audiences, new commercial opportunities, and new visibility for the sport. It also brought intensified scrutiny of every aspect of the league's operations, including how the league handles conflicts involving its most visible player. The eyes that are watching are not only those of longtime fans. They are the eyes of new audiences who are forming their first impressions of the league's character and its standards. What those audiences observe in the handling of incidents like this one becomes part of how they evaluate the institution. The specific dynamics of this incident also raise a broader issue about the role of social media in professional sports. Platforms like Threads, X, and Instagram have become unofficial extensions of the competitive arena. Players use them to communicate directly with fans, build personal brands, and respond to commentary in real time. That accessibility is a significant asset in terms of fan engagement. It is also a significant liability when it creates situations in which athletes are engaging with content that should be referred to professional communications staff or, in cases like this one, to league officials directly. There is no suggestion here that athletes do not have the right to maintain social media accounts or to engage with their audiences. What is at issue is the judgment being exercised in those engagements, and the league's responsibility to establish clear parameters around conduct that crosses from fan interaction into the territory of endorsing hostility toward other players. Those parameters, to be effective, need to be enforced visibly and consistently. Selective enforcement, or the absence of enforcement, produces exactly the kind of environment in which players and fans come to believe that certain conduct is tolerated regardless of what the official code says. It is also worth addressing the framing that has sometimes been applied to Clark in coverage of incidents involving her. A consistent pattern has emerged in which incidents that raise legitimate safety concerns are redirected toward questions about Clark's response to those incidents, or about whether the attention she receives is generating the tensions that produce such conduct. This framing is worth examining critically. The documented record shows that Clark has not been the aggressor in the incidents that have generated concern. She has been the target of documented stalking, the subject of threatening online commentary, and now the named focus of an exchange in which a fellow professional athlete confirmed the legitimacy of posts referencing physical threat. Redirecting the analysis toward Clark's conduct
her public profile, or the media attention she attracts does not address what actually happened. It redistributes responsibility in a way that is not supported by the facts of the documented incidents.
The institutional obligation here is clear. A professional sports league has a duty of care to the players under its jurisdiction. That duty extends beyond physical safety during games. It extends to the conditions created by public conduct, including public conduct by other players on social media. When the league's response to documented conduct of this kind is absence, no statement, no visible process, no communicated standard, it is communicating, in practical terms, that the threshold for institutional response has not been met. That communication, whether intended or not, has consequences. It shapes what players believe they can do without consequence. It shapes what fans believe is endorsed, and it shapes the perceptions of the broader public, including the new audiences whose engagement with the league is still being formed. The commercial argument for inaction deserves to be examined directly because it has been cited explicitly or implicitly in discussions of how the league weighs these decisions. The argument holds that aggressive conduct enforcement risks alienating players who are themselves significant commercial assets, or that introducing conflict into a period of league growth creates unnecessary friction. This argument has a surface logic, but it does not hold up under examination. The commercial value of a professional sports league is tied, over the long term, to the credibility of its institutional standards. Leagues that develop reputations for inconsistent or commercially motivated enforcement of conduct rules do not benefit commercially from that reputation over time. They incur reputational costs that accumulate and eventually affect the very metrics they were trying to protect. The situation documented here, a player publicly endorsing user posts that referenced physical threat against a named opponent, in a context where that opponent had prior documented experience with credible law enforcement confirmed threats, represented a concrete opportunity for the WNBA to demonstrate the strength and consistency of its conduct standards. The opportunity was not taken, that decision, if it was a decision, or that absence, if it was simply the product of institutional inertia, will be evaluated over time not in isolation but as part of a larger pattern. Fans, analysts, and current and prospective players will all be drawing conclusions from it. The expectation going forward, as expressed clearly and consistently in the public record of viewer and fan response, is not extraordinary. It is the standard expectation applied to any professional organization, that conduct which creates hostile conditions for its employees is addressed with transparency and appropriate consequences. That standard is not punitive in motivation. It is the basic requirement of a functioning professional institution. The WNBA's ability to meet that standard across this incident and others that will follow will define a significant part of its institutional identity in the years ahead. The broader cultural environment in which this incident occurred is also relevant to any serious analysis. Professional women's sports have spent decades working to build the kind of commercial infrastructure and mainstream visibility that the WNBA is currently experiencing. That progress has been driven by sustained effort from players, coaches, administrators, and advocates who recognize the long-term value of the sport and invested in its development despite structural disadvantages in coverage, compensation, and institutional support. The current moment, marked by record attendance, expanded broadcasting agreements, and genuine public interest, is the product of that investment. Protecting that moment requires more than sustaining positive metrics. It requires that the league demonstrate an institutional character that can bear scrutiny. When incidents arise that test the consistency and credibility of the league's standards, the manner in which those incidents are handled either reinforces or undermines the broader project of building a sustainable professional institution. Fans who have been invested in that project for years, and who are now watching new audiences form their first impressions of the league, have a reasonable basis for expecting that the league will hold itself to the standards it claims to uphold. The specific comments from viewers following coverage of this incident were not driven by hostility toward the league or its players. They reflected a particular kind of frustration. The frustration of supporters who believe the league is capable of better, and who have seen enough instances of inadequate accountability to doubt whether the institutional will exist to enforce it. That distinction matters. Criticism from invested stakeholders is a different signal than hostility from disengaged observers. Leagues that fail to distinguish between the two, or that respond to all criticism as if it were bad faith opposition, lose the ability to hear the feedback that would actually help them improve. The player conduct standards that exist in professional sports are not abstract principles. They are operational rules with direct consequences for real individuals. In this case, one of those individuals is a player with a documented history of receiving credible physical threats, who was the named target of a social media exchange in which another player confirmed the legitimacy of posts referencing coordinated physical action. The operational question is straightforward.
Does the WNBA's conduct framework cover this type of situation, and if it does, what is the appropriate response?
If the framework does not cover it, the gap needs to be addressed explicitly with clear guidelines that account for the reality of social media as a professional communications environment. If the framework does cover it and no action was taken, the league needs to explain the standard it is applying and why this situation did not meet the threshold for a visible response. Either way, the absence of any public communication from the league on this matter is not a satisfactory institutional position. It leaves players, fans, and external observers without any indication of where the league stands and what, if anything, constitutes a violation of its standards in the context of social media conduct. Professional leagues that have navigated comparable situations effectively have generally done so by establishing clear, publicly communicated standards, applying those standards consistently regardless of the commercial profile of the players involved, and communicating their decisions in ways that reinforce the integrity of the process. That approach is not without complications. Any conduct enforcement regime will face edge cases and judgment calls that invite debate. But a regime that operates with transparency and consistency builds credibility over time, even when individual decisions are contested. A regime that is invisible, inconsistent, or apparently responsive to commercial considerations builds the opposite. The WNBA stands at a moment when the decisions it makes about institutional character will have lasting consequences. The league has earned a level of public attention and commercial momentum that creates an opportunity to build something durable. Whether it takes advantage of that opportunity depends, in large part, on whether it is willing to apply the standards of a serious professional institution to the full range of situations its players and operations generate, including the uncomfortable ones. The incident documented here was one of those situations. How the league handles the ones that follow will say more about its institutional character than any broadcast agreement or attendance record.